A lot of us think we've read Homer, but most of us haven't. We've read Pope, or Wilson, or Fitzgerald, or Lattimore, or Fagles, or Chapman. Because there's no such thing as the Odyssey. There are only Odysseys. John Keats has a wonderful poem titled On First Looking into Chapman's Homer, which I think perfectly conveys how translation is incredibly impactful. Prior to reading Chapman's Homer, Keats had read Pope and Dryden's translations and had never really loved Homer. But after he read Chapman's translation in the dark with his friend, he actually wrote this poem on a piece of paper and his friend recovered it. And this is what the poem reads. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his domain. Yet did I never breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out, loud and bold. Then felt I, like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken. Or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise. Keats couldn't read Greek. Besides boarding school, he'd never had a formal literary education, and he read voraciously, however. Yet he never really related to Homer before he had read Chapman's version, which, despite having been written a century before the typical translation of his time, like Pope's, resonated way more deeply. Matthew Arnold's classic essay on translating Homer identifies 4 principles that a good Homeric translation needs according to him. It needs to be rapid, plain and direct in expression, plain and direct in ideas, and noble. And interesting enough, the same translation that awakened Keats's love for Homer was not Arnold's favorite. He said that Chapman renders Homer ill because he is fantastic in his ideas. And although he thought, for example, that Chapman's diction was better than Pope's, he thought because Chapman's Homer was too fantastical that he wasn't plain enough. An intriguing side note, scholars all agree that Chapman's version of Homer is the one that Shakespeare read, and that it directly influenced what he was able to write about because it gave him new ideas. But what Arnold points out indirectly is that every new translation of Homer is a new version of Homer, is a new life to Homer. German cultural critic and philosopher Walter Benjamin wrote The Task of the Translator, or The Translator's Task, originally written in German. I read it in English, and while Arnold tells us what he thinks Homer is and what Homeric translation should be, Benjamin totally subverts the idea of what we typically see translation as. He talks about translation as a form of creation, not just as a means to convey ideas from one language into the other. In principle, Benjamin rejects the idea that translation is supposed to replace the original text and convey meaning within it. And as such, there is no such thing as a neutral translation. Let's take the 5th word of the Odyssey as a prime example. The 5th word, please excuse my pronunciation, I am not a classicist, nor do I speak ancient Greek, is polytropos. But in my research, I learned that in ancient Greek, this word comes from poly and then thropos. Poly meaning many or much, and thropos meaning turns or twisty. So what is a translator to do when they are faced with this word that doesn't have an analogous one in English? Well, each translator takes a new approach. Fagles translates it to a man of many twists and turns. Lattimore translates it to a man of many ways. Wilson takes a different approach and uses complicated. Her choice is one of the more controversial ones, but I'll explain why I like it, and it's because complicare is the Latin etymology of complicated. Com means together, and plicare means to fold or enfolded. So he is a many-enfolded man if we are to go to the Latin origin of the word complicated. And syntactically, it's also an interesting word because it is not the first word, it's the 5th word. And it refers to not only the man, but also the journey and the poem itself. So I personally do like complicated, even though it's not as transliteral as the other ones, I would say. Whatever choice a translator makes, it highlights what Benjamin is saying, which is that translation is all on its own an act of creation, a creative process where we show the affinities between languages. Languages are not interchangeable containers. They are living things that have relationships to each other. Whatever frequency or thread a translator chooses to pick up on creates a new literature, a new world. Without George Chapman or Alexander Pope, Shakespeare would have never read Homer when he did, nor would Keats have written his poem. English literature would literally be different without those translations. And notice that this is not about the Greek or Homer. It's about Chapman's revival of Keats's excitement for Homer, which brings up one of Benjamin's most important points, that translations and texts have afterlives. He writes, "Just as expressions of life are connected in the most intimate manner with the living being without having any significance for the latter, a translation proceeds from the original, not indeed so much from its life as from its afterlife or survival, Überleben." Also don't speak German. Hope my pronunciation was all right. I am learning German though, I am trying. So while Arnold asks, who is Homer or what is Homer, Benjamin asks what becomes of Homer. Because translations are as much cultural objects as the originals are. In his wonderful video discussing the Homeric epics, Benjamin McAvoy talks about how through different ages either epic was more popular. So during the what he calls boring Victorian era, the Iliad, which is all about war and power and fighting on, was more popular. Whereas nowadays, the Odyssey has twice as many ratings as the Iliad, and the Odyssey is about, as he says, coming home in your heart. And then that shows what resonates in each cultural moment. Not only does it resonate culturally or more in terms of society, it also resonates personally. Each culture and society that is responding is a culmination of individuals, and which texts, the Iliad or the Odyssey, resonates with you more tells you something about what moment in your life you are. So clearly these texts have afterlives, and each translation is a new version of the text trying to do something for the age in which it was written. Therefore, the Odyssey does not have a stable text. It only exists as a series of interpretive reconstructions, where era, reader, and writer or translator change those dynamics. And this representational and semantic instability is actually eerily relevant for the Homeric question, the question of who Homer was, if he ever was. Modern scholarship doesn't take for granted that Homer was one man. Adam Nicholson writes it in his book, Why Homer Matters, that the idea is that Homer was not necessarily a single person. It was a culture that produced these foundational and important myths for ancient Greek society. And there's very little information about Homer himself. I think there are at least 7 places that are listed as Homer's birthplace. And Samuel Butler, who was one of George Bernard Shaw's favorite writers of the late 19th century, I believe, wrote an entire text called The Authoress of the Odyssey, wherein he argued that he believes that the Odyssey was written by a woman.
I'd be like, so Homer, how do you feel about the screen time given to these women, considering how little you spent with them?
Funny side note, Samuel Butler wrote a utopian novel called Erewhon, and if you've ever been in LA, you know that there's this series of supermarkets called Erewhon, and I'm pretty sure it's based on that utopic novel, so that question comes up on Jeopardy, I got you. Anyway, even though there was this general conjecture that Homer was a blind bard, there's in fact a beautiful scene, moving scene in the Odyssey where a blind bard is involved and people think that's Homer referring to himself. There's a clear instability of around who or what Homer was and is. And there are even doubts about when the poem was composed, even in the ancient Greek. Caroline Alexander, in her introduction to the Iliad, writes that translating Homer isn't a simple task. She says that in the case of the Iliad, the Greek text prepared by Martin L. West she uses for her translations is based on over 1,500 manuscript and papyrus fragments, dating from the 3rd century BC to the 14th century AD. Together with a considerable ancient scholarly commentary and quotations, which all have to be consulted. Therein lies another massive problem or question in the realm of the Homeric question. because there have been recompositions at both large and small scales. Because this was an oral poem, there's no doubt that every time it was retold, something here or there must have changed. That's why when you read Homer, we have swift-footed Achilles or rosy-fingered Dawn, because these repeated epithets allow us to remember who these characters are and give the speaker these repetitions. Nonetheless, with every recitation and transcription, there was probably some kind of change in the original Homeric texts. So that's before we even get into the interlinguistic instability. Even in the original, there's not necessarily an original. So we're at a point of plurality before we even get to translation. And then we add on the layer of translation, which creates another instability. So I would say that the most interesting thing when discussing translations of Homer is not necessarily which translation is most faithful to Homer. I would say the really interesting thing is what each translation reveals about the era in which it was produced, as well as the people who produced it. So now we know that each translator is not just interpreting Homer, but reconstructing a possible Homer. So which possible Homer should you read? Well, with over 60 translations available of the Odyssey, I would recommend you take a look at a couple of the main ones before you decide which one to do. But you don't actually have to buy the books to do that, nor do you have to leave your seat if you're sitting right now. As I was researching this video, I came across the R Classics subreddit where somebody posted an awesome online resource that they made, where there are different parts of the Odyssey, different passages that you can compare between up to 6 translations. I'll link it in the description. I mean, shout out to this person. This is such an awesome resource to have. But right now, I'll give you 6 suggestions, and then you can choose from there, perhaps, which Homer you'd like to meet. If you, like Arnold, believe that Homer should be defined by speed, clarity, and directness, I would say that the best contemporary attempt of that is Emily Wilson's translation. I know there's a lot of controversy surrounding her translations, but if you read them, they're not really any of this post-feminist takes that people are saying that they are. Her foci are meter, sound, performability, and multivocality. While in the ancient Greek, these poems are written in dactylic hexameter, which is the typical epic meter, Wilson writes in iambic pentameter, which is the most classical English meter. So she's trying to convey that orality that the original Homeric projects have. And I think her style is the most Arnoldian in spirit. It's clean, it's structurally simple, it's fast, and it's noble. If you feel that reading Homer should be monumental, that it should be this epic, poetic grandeur, then read the Alexander Pope translations. Pope is all about creating that epicness in his language. If you also like rhyme, Pope wrote in rhyming couplets, which does stray a little bit from the Homeric style, as the Homeric poems don't rhyme. But if you want to feel epic, or if you want rhyming poetry, then I would say go for the Pope translation. 2 of my dearest friends love the Fitzgerald translation, the Robert Fitzgerald translation, and I think it's because it renders Homer so beautifully. When you read Fitzgerald's Homer, it feels like it fits right in there between Shakespeare and Milton. Fitzgerald's translations really do embody Arnold's principle of nobility. The language is beautiful, the things flow from one thing to another, and it is a rather awesome translation. So if you want this beauty and poetry and lyricism, I would say go for the Fitzgerald. If you want to feel like you're reading a movie, then go for the Fagles translation. Fagles really focuses on forward-driving epic action without losing the sense of Homerity, whatever that may be. I would say it's one of the most influential attempts at putting Homeric grandeur into more modern-like storytelling. If you, like Benjamin, think it's important to preserve the grammatical structures and signifiers of the original, then I would say go for the Richmond Lattimore translation, because he really tries to preserve the grammatical construction of each line, even when it's rendered more awkward in English, which makes it quite Benjaminian, I would say. And if you want to encounter the Homer that produced Keats's sublime experience, or read the Homer that Shakespeare read the Chapman. I would challenge you to read the Iliad and or the Odyssey each year. I have read 2 translations this year, and from here on out, I think I'm going to read the Iliad one year and the Odyssey the other year, because there are just so many books that I want to read in my life. But I would recommend not only that you try rereading different translations each time, because every time you engage with Homer with a different translation, as you know, you engage with a new Homer, but also to try to read it aloud. The first time I read them, I was trying to kind of get through them quickly, so I read them in my head, and the second time I read them aloud, and it was just a game changer, really. These are oral poems. They are like Milton in Paradise Lost, where they almost beg you to be read aloud, and it really is a wonderful experience as a reader. It's a totally different experience. When we imagine translations, we typically imagine palimpsests, one thing written over another, one author looming behind a text that another is trying to repiece together. But we now know that that's not necessarily the case for translation in general, but especially for Homeric translations. Because we now know that there is no single Homer behind all of these translations. There are only different forms of Homer taken in different languages at different times for different readers. Ultimately, I would say that the question of best translation is inherently speculative at best. Because as we've seen, every translation is a philosophical choice about what the text is or ought to be. And every time we encounter a new translation, we are encountering a new Homeric afterlife. Thank you for watching this video. Thank you for your time and attention. I appreciate it always. Let me know what your favorite translation of Homer is and why. I post weekly articles on my Substack and newsletters every other month with Book 11, a journal of literary philosophy. If you're interested in hearing more from me, subscribe to those things. Please let me know if there's anything else you'd like to hear from me, any further questions you have, and thank you again. And read on.